Okay, Mr. Chair, it looks like we have most of the work group members present. If you want to go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks, Chip. Yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to the fourth meeting of the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council's Private Recreational Reporting Workgroup. I appreciate everybody taking time to join this meeting. We all had high hopes to be able to do this meeting in person, but once again, we've been foiled by events, and so we'll do the best we can in our virtual setting. So sort of the goal for today is to come out of this meeting with some recommendations, specific recommendations back to the South Atlantic Council that can be considered and possibly incorporated in management actions going forward pursuant to the snapper grouper fishery. So we've got an agenda. Is there any requests for additions or modifications to the agenda? If so, just raise your hand. Don't see any hands, so we'll consider the agenda adopted by consent. At this point, I'll welcome any public comment. If we've got any tips, anybody that's signed up, or if you just simply want to make public comment, you can raise your hand and be identified.
I'm not seeing any hands.
All right, thanks, Chip. Okay, takes care of that. Our next agenda item is updates. I believe we have John Foster online to give us some updates on some of the work that's being done regarding rare event estimations. So, John, I'll turn it over to you, and good to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mr. Chairman, and good to be with you all. As you know, I'm substituting today for Richard Cody, who's traveling for a family event. I don't have a lot to update on specifically for the rare event work group for a variety of reasons. It's been it hasn't been meeting regularly since about March or spring anyway of 2020. The last activity of the work group before sort of taking a pause, I suppose, was the report that we had and the analysis and report we had completed that was led by John Opsimer, one of the MRIP statistical consultants who's at Westat. And that analysis was looking at sort of a variety of methods for using multi-year averages for these cases of rare event, highly imprecise estimates. That report is at this point finalized. I think Richard had talked about it before with this group, but basically it looked at different ways of using a range of years of data, averaging different weighting schemes for averaging the data across different years to produce estimates. And the basic conclusions were that more years produce more precise estimates. And then there are some differences as to whether you use data from the current and prior years, or if you are in the situation where you're able to use for a given year data from both prior years and future years, and how you might weight the data coming from the different years. Since then, again, the work group has been inactive, but not disbanded. We anticipate reconvening it this year. One of the reasons that we hadn't been meeting regularly was a number of requirements coming from the Modern Fish Act. We felt could be relevant to the work group's topic, and in particular the National Academy study that was required by the Modern Fish Act, which has sent its final report in as of late last year. and we are currently working on preparing responses in a report as required by Congress in the Act for the different recommendations and conclusions that are in that study, gathering feedback from across the agency as well as from regional partners as well. One other topic, or a couple of other topics I'll mention. One is also coming from the Modern Fish Act. The agency was directed to spend additional funds on data collections, and for the Atlantic coast, that equated to an increase of roughly $900,000 in funding that was made available for APIS, the intercept survey sampling component. And Tom Sminke, who was with us at the time but has since retired, coordinated with both ACCSP and the state partners to develop sort of targeted allocations for that additional funding in terms of increasing sample in ways that would, we were hoping would increase the precision for managed species and some of these rare event species in particular. So that, those allocations have been developed. We're still sort of in the process of evaluating improvements to precision. And we hope to make those sort of monitoring those precision changes part of sort of the annual status reporting for APIS, for the Access Point Angler Intercept Survey. And so again, we appreciate ACCSP and the state partners' time and efforts on that. Another item I'll mention that is relevant as well is the large pelagic survey. I think I mentioned at a previous meeting talking about that survey's design that the intercept component was undergoing a redesign project and had several years worth of field pilot study work underway. We are in I believe this will be this year, 2022, will be the final year of the field work. But the design is novel in that it's been testing both sort of a more traditional probability-based approach for sampling in the intercept component, which is very similar or analogous to the APIS design. But in addition to that, it has a variation of adaptive sampling built in as well that uses roughly 25% of the assignments that are allocated, again, using an adaptive approach. And so the work is ongoing, and that is, to help increase observations, intercepts for, again, some of the more rare event species within the large pelagic survey, which is already focused on, generally uncommon or infrequently encountered, highly migratory species within the overall recreational fishery. So that work is bearing fruit as well. It is looking promising, that general approach of both more traditional probability-based sampling combined with a small component that is adaptive in nature, again, to help increase the productivity of producing intercepts with observations for again, some of those harder to locate species. So sort of looking forward then, again, we do anticipate at some point this year reconvening the work group and re-engaging moving forward. Richard is committed to doing that. I don't have a specific timeline right now. We're heavily focused on completing the report to Congress, as I mentioned, and also working through and supporting the transition process for the Gulf of Mexico red snapper data collection programs as well, which has a significant workshop coming up at the end of this month. So I believe that is all that I have, but I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that the group has. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that. And I'll open it up. Questions for John from the work group? Just raise your hand and I'll call on you. All right, go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Bud. Hey, John, good to hear from you. And I know you guys have been busy with a lot of updates. But one of the things that we're tasked with this group is to, come up with recommendations for improving sort of recreational catch statistics. And one of the things that has kind of remained maybe a little ambiguous is the allocation of sampling effort and how that's distributed kind of coast-wide or even nationally for MRIP, and what is the scope with which we could reallocate potentially to focus more on the snapper grouper fishery.
Sure, thanks, Eric. So I think there's certainly flexibility there. There are considerations both distributing sample amongst regions, but then also within regions to target different fisheries, given that the survey is a multi-use general survey. And I apologize, I don't have all the specifics on what the new allocations look like, but essentially the thought of expanding the sort of offshore site group stratum, which is in place in Florida, that is still under consideration for other states. And in this region, I think North Carolina is the next state that looks promising for, again, for having enough sites with sort of, reliable or predictable or substantial enough offshore activity that it can be targeted with sample, and it's worth sort of pulling those sites into a separate stratum, and also sort of identifying species that may assist with that. There could be sites that have a fair amount of offshore activity, but is it predictably for snapper grouper, groundfish? Is it for HMS or a variety of things? So that is one idea that again is still on the table. I'm not sure exactly where we are with it, but beyond that, in a general sense, sample has traditionally been allocated sort of proportional to effort. And so even with that approach, looking at targeting the increased sample towards cells that have more offshore activity, more estimated private boat effort in the EEZ, or at least the ocean areas, is another way to sort of at sort of the highest level partition the sampling that way. And I think as a first cut at it, that was a lot of the thinking, the rationale for targeting some of these the cells that the sample went into. So which waves of the year, which months of the year, again, what kind of day, what site groups, things like that, as far as again, making those targeted improvements. We haven't yet had much time to evaluate improvements in precision, but again, that's on the list to do, and it will be incorporated into sort of the regular annual performance reports for APIS moving forward.
Thanks, John.
Before I go to you, Jeff, I've got a question, John, and I certainly don't want folks listening to think that this is a fait accompli with regard to the future of snapper grouper fishery, but if fishing for or possession of snapper grouper was constrained within a season, So the whole, this is theoretical, the entire aggregate or a subset of the aggregate of the snapper grouper fishery was constrained within a 3-month or a 6-month season. I assume that would help with regard to sampling, because if you knew the activity was constrained temporarily, would that allow you to reallocate resources spatially to have better coverage? So just a question.
Yes, certainly, with knowing that a fixed season is planned for, that definitely allows us the ability to adjust sample, and we have done that. I won't say numerous times, but we have done it in response to again, sort of some of the red snapper short seasons, a number of years back. Being able to, we don't have to formally stratify or change the strata of the intercept survey. So if you have a season that doesn't, perfectly align along 2-month waves or 1 month or weekends versus weekdays, things like that, it can be the length of the season can vary, and also within that window of time, if it's even more tailored than that, say, weekends versus weekdays or some mix of days, those things can be, we can adjust essentially the probabilities for choosing sample assignments to reflect that season. Now, we have to maintain coverage, of course, for covering the other species, but yes, there is the ability not only to adjust sample allocations across the month, so potentially moving sample from, say, 1 month or one wave to another, or from one mode site group to another, so shore versus private boat, things like that. We can do that, but then even at a finer scale, there is the ability, say it's a 45-day season or a 70-day season, 90-day, whatever it might be. We do have the ability to make those kinds of adjustments. But again, the more advance notice, the better. And I will also say, though, that at some point, it does become more difficult. So if it's a handful of days, we can still target sample into those days. But again, if it's a small season compounded by a very rare event species, certainly the resulting estimates are still likely to be imprecise. But again, the short answer to your question is yes, there is flexibility and the ability to target sample, again, sort of at a substratum level or in a way that crosses strata.
All right, thanks. Jeff, I'll call on you.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really just wanted to add to what John has talked about with the extra Modern Fish Act funds with APIS sampling in the South Atlantic in 2021. And so, of course, the design components are up to MRIP with the state conduct cooperation of APIS. The allocations in 2021, there was about a 28% increase in site assignments coastwide. So that's, for scale, coastwide we do about 9,500 APIS assignments a year historically. And in 2021, we added about 2,100 additional assignments. The weighting of those, there were more, while it's 28% coastwide, the South Atlantic, because of the species diversity and because of the longer seasons, got more of those assignments. And really, it's a thanks to the state staff. The states were able to ramp up their staff, get out and get those done. But the South Atlantic states were, maybe on the higher end of where we ended up. It was probably 30 to 42, I think, % increases by state. North Carolina through Georgia. And remember, the Gulf States Commission guides the sampling in Florida, so I can't really speak to Florida. And those allocations were focused on boat modes. As John noted, it's really hard to target site days for offshore trips or for particular species, but adding more sample in those particular months, speaking to the seasonal issues, is certainly doable in how those assignments get done. And so, again, just thanks to the states, in 2021, they were able to add staff, they were able to get those extra assignments done. And the one thing that from when this work group was initially conceived until now, the new MREP estimate query websites has been released for kind of testing. And I've looked through a few of those species, and the PSEs, if one looks at South Atlantic region combined and annual combined, you do see for like gag and red snapper reasonable estimates that have PSEs under 50. But again, I didn't want to get too far into the weeds on the PSE parts, but that doesn't always work for state by state estimates. And of course, 2021 data where we had the extra sampling occur will be published out. I believe it's soon. I don't know if that's going to be February 15th or in the next couple of weeks, but those were just some thoughts about the sampling overall, the ability to look at the estimates from 2021 on kind of that regional basis. So thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Any other questions for John before we move along? I don't see any names in the queue, so I guess not. So again, John, thanks for that. And I assume you're going to stay with us for the rest of the meeting, because I think we're going to be getting to some topics where we'll need your expertise to help us better understand some of the options going forward. So next thing you see under updates is a paragraph describing the current situation of the Joint Gulf South Atlantic Council Work Group on Section 102 of the Modern Fish Act. You can see there, the group's sort of gone dormant. The two individuals that were carrying it have changed job titles, and so it's kind of in a limbo right now, in need of a chair. I'm sure if anybody in the work group would like to volunteer for that job, folks would be ecstatic. Any insight or update on that, John Carmichael?
Yeah, so thank you, Spud. Now that pretty much covers it, what's shown there. We are looking in a chair, so maybe twist some arms and get someone. I think, presuming that this group of ours creates some recommendations here today, and then we review them with the council in March, that it would really make sense perhaps to have a meeting of this group before the Gulf and South Atlantic each meet again in June. So I think what I would do is reach out to the Gulf Council and see if we can't put something together and maybe at least get someone to chair a meeting at least, so we can sort of think a bit about what the next steps of that group is.
All right, thanks. Okay. Next thing you see is work group recommendations. And can Skip or John, can we put up do we have the ability to put up the meeting summary from our December 1st summary? Is that
yeah,
available?
yes, but I can put that right up for you, because we have that, and then we have the other attachment that kind of gives a summary of everything we've talked about so far.
Right. Just kind of, I'll tell you what, if you can scroll down to, I guess really it's the top of page 2. Go back up.
There we go.
The top.
Yep.
Yeah, right there. I think this is, we sort of need to all make sure we understand this is where we're at right now after our third meeting. And after having presentations on different state capacities to implement something similar to what Florida has done, after pretty robust discussion, it was a general agreement, and I'm not going to call it consensus by any means, but the general agreement was that a federal solution is probably the best course of action for federal fishery, and that snapper grouper endorsement is a logical next step to the recreational angler registry that was created several years ago, and state marine recreational fishing licenses or permits, whatever the instrument may be that was created to allow state exemptions from that marine recreational angler registry. And the concept of a permit with endorsements is commonly used in commercial fisheries management and other natural resources. So we discussed a potential recommendation for the council to consider requiring a permit for snapper grouper fishing, similar to what Florida is doing with their refish survey, but could be administered by NIMS as is done with the HMS permit. Permit would be used to identify snapper grouper anglers to support dedicated survey efforts, so forth and so on. That last sentence is probably the one that is most important and one that we've got to have a real honest dialogue about, and that is the permit would need to be accompanied by changes in MRIP sampling or new sampling and survey programs to provide the desired improvements in catch and effort estimates. So with that, I think that's good. Chip and John, we can bounce back to the other that other document. I sort of wanted to get that out there so we all sort of knew how we got to where we are. We've obviously digested a lot of information over 3 meetings, examples of specialty surveys that are being used, and John updated us on some of that. But again, we go back to our basic purpose here is to obviously improve the accuracy and precision of catch and effort estimates for the South Atlantic snapper grouper fishery, which we all know is a very diverse fishery, and one that is diverse, not only species wise, but across the region in terms of when that fishery is prosecuted, how it's prosecuted. So with that, John, did you want to walk us through that, or do you want me to do it?
Sure, Spud. I'll be glad to walk through it. And what we have in this document is just an attempt by the staff here to gather what's been discussed at the prior work group meetings and start to put them in some language that could stand as recommendations that this group would ideally at this meeting reach consensus on, and then take forward to the council for consideration at the March meeting. And then, the council would potentially start to think about where and how these different things make their way into the management program, what potential amendments would be considered to address it. So a lot of this is built off of the discussion at the last meeting, as Spud highlighted. And so there's a couple of pieces here for us to talk about today. One is just the general statement to reiterate that a federal permitting and reporting solution most appropriate, and then various things in italics to try and capture some more detail on that. This is a Word document, so we can add some bullet points, etc., through this as we go, which I think will be helpful for the group to work through its consensus. That's the first section, and then there were points made at prior meetings about what would be necessary for success for permitting and reporting. And then there were various topics about potential research and data recommendations that would need to go along with this as well. So I think what we can do is just sort of work through these 1, 2, 3. As different items come up, we can put them in here where they belong. The goal is to make sure that we fully capture all the points that are relevant to these 3 main areas. And if there's anything in there that the group kind of says, hey, no way to, then we can get rid of that as well. So I think with that, Spud, we can probably open it up for the conversation here on number one. We tried to capture the purpose to identify the universe of anglers, to improve sampling and catch estimates. That was the charge of the group, right? We're looking at permitting. We're looking at ways to improve sampling and catch estimates. Permits is viewed as one way to do it, but we're not really in the business of trying to come up with a permit just for a permit's sake. The second set of italics looked at things similar to, say, the HMS permit, which has the permit as well as the associated LPS survey. We also talked considering a range of reporting requirements for the different species in the complex, which I think is important because reporting and surveying and stuff is expensive. It takes time from fishermen. So it may not be something we necessarily need for every species in the complex, because some have potentially have PSE levels and sampling reliability that's acceptable. And then the last one, just considering what existing surveys are, along that lines. Are there things that are already met pretty well? In which case, can we potentially narrow the range of species considered, which is like HMS? There's certain species that have certain requirements. So, I think all of these are on the table, and the more we can get ideas here, I think the better off the council discussion will be in March. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'll open it up to you to take us through discussion.
All right, thanks, John. And before we do, and I'll call on you, Eric, in a second, I just want to read something from the executive summary of the document called Better Defining the Universe of Offshore Recreational Anglers. This was reported recommendations of the Marine Fisheries Advisory Committee back in October 2020. I think everybody's probably had this. Some of you are probably very familiar with it, but there's a paragraph in here that I think is relevant and illustrates that our thinking is in line with other people who are interested in and living in the world of trying to improve data on federal fisheries. And it says, in summary, this challenge has been widely discussed by stakeholders, regulators, and in academic reviews of the recreational fishing data collection systems. There is a general agreement that efforts to identify the subset of licensed anglers that target federal species could provide additional accuracy and improved communication with anglers. Additional thorough review of the design and potential execution of a federal permit would need to be conducted to ensure such a program provides cost benefits to anglers and fisheries managers. As such, we make these recommendations for advancing potential solutions. And then they basically go through and reference the Modern Fish Act, and NOAA Fisheries should notify Congress of potential opportunities to use this method to improve data collection efforts. And then NOAA Fisheries should collaborate with key state and regional council fishery managers on identifying the need for and benefits, if any, of layering in an offshore recreational permit to identify the universe of offshore anglers region by region. Based on the outcome of this collaboration, should NOAA Fisheries decide to move forward with such a permit, the Secretary of Commerce should request congressional authority for NOAA to implement a federal recreational offshore permit. So, obviously this has been talked about before, but as we all know, the devil is always in the details of how you do it and when you do it and so forth and so on. So with that, Eric, you got your hand raised, so I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Bud. That was a good summary, and you're right that the devil is in the details. And so when I read the language, I don't disagree with the notion of a recreational permit. The issue is we've been using a lot of language of additional accuracy, improving sampling and catch estimates. Those are all statements that say that this permit is going to enhance current sampling protocols, is the way I read that, versus bringing in whole new programs built around the permit itself. So what I guess the question to John Foster is, if we hand him over a database of recreational permit holders, what can MRIP do with that to improve their catch estimates and effort estimates?
Yeah, I think that's a very relevant and important question, because all this has to be done in concert in order to make the outcome of this be what we want. You know, a permit in and of itself does not necessarily result in any improvements. So John, would you like to just put you on the spot, and obviously, you know, you're not binding yourself or the agency to anything. This is just an open discussion, so we can make the best recommendations we can.
Okay, good. So as long as I don't have to design a whole program right now in 30 seconds, I'm happy to make some comments. So, you know, I'll try to give a little flavor, I think, of what is possible, but again, it really will depend on at some point a decision has to be made, I think, as to, you know, to where what really is the goal. Is the goal sort of complete reporting, complete enumeration, census, logbook, any of those kinds of you know, approaches, or is it that the desire is still to stay with sampling for a variety of reasons, respondent burden, angler burden, things like that, cost, you know, a number of potential considerations there. You know, that's a very high level decision and has big implications. So if it goes the sort of logbook census route, you know, I'd say all things considered, that's probably a much larger change, more resources required. But, you know, with the benefit of, if it's fully implemented and there is good compliance and sustained compliance, obviously you're generating a much richer, more complete data set from which to work. On the survey side, you know, there I think there's more options, more considerations, and I'll just sort of start, you know, kind of as I see it, again, off the top of my head here. You know, if at the very simplest, you know, that list of permits would help enrich the frame for the fishing effort survey. And again, assuming we're talking here about private anglers, enriching that frame, adding additional detail to the frame, allows a number of options. One, it can improve the efficiency of sampling without any additional changes. But with that information, again, identifying the licensed or permitted universe, you know, there could be modifications to the FES, again, the questionnaire that might, you know, pull out more targeted information, kinds of trips, target species, being able to partition effort between permitted and unpermitted. Again, all with you know, trade-off decisions about cost and sample sizes, respondent reporting burden, accuracy of reporting, all of those. Again, the more changes we make, the more development time it will take, and the more resources that need to go along with that. Correspondingly, then with the APIS, with the intercept survey, you know, we would be looking at potentially no change all the way up to additional questions, permit identification, or identifying, you know, permitted vessels or permit holders, depending on how it's structured. I'd go back to the LPS with its design on the intercept component. There are at least 3 questions, 2 to 3 questions that are getting at vessel identification. The permit number, the Atlantic HMS permit number is collected. The vessel identifier, either state registration number or, you know, U.S. Coast Guard documentation number, is collected, as well as boat name and home port or principal port. So it would be, to get definitive identifications as to whether, a vessel has the permit or not, at least in the setting of the LPS, it may be more intrusive than anglers in this region might be used to. So there might be a communication, there might be need for additional communications around it to facilitate that. So again, there's a range of possible considerations here, but with again the benefit of more precise estimates, potentially more accurate estimates. Although with what I've described, we're not necessarily changing if we stay within the basic framework of the existing surveys, we're not necessarily changing the coverage. So again, we're still talking about intercepting it at the APIS public sites, publicly available sites. We're still talking about some form of off-site complementary effort survey. But then, there are other options too. You could build an entirely separate specialized survey off of this one frame or the permit list. And again, the whole other side of the aisle with census-based approaches, logbooks with validation, capture, recapture designs. So, sorry, I'll go ahead and wrap up. I know I'm sort of covering a lot of ground and jumping around. If there's additional questions on this, I'm happy to take a shot.
No, I think that's very helpful, John, and it's exactly what we need. I mean, it's sort of this stream of consciousness thinking, because, ultimately, when this moves to the council, those council members that haven't been intimately involved in this are going to look at this and ask probably one simple question, and that is, if this goes forward and we require either a vessel permit or an individual permit for possession of fishing for snapper grouper species, are we going to be better off if nothing else changes other than just the permit requirement? Or do all these other things have to happen to make it worthwhile? And I think you've answered that question, at least I think it's been answered, to say yes. If all other things remain the same, we still would be better off to have the permit and have that identified universe of people who are fishing than to not have it. And with that, I'm gonna go to Luis, and then I'll go to you, Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And yes, and as a follow-up to those thoughts, Spud, and to some of John's points there, thank you for bringing those up, John. I think that was very helpful. I was thinking really about potentially, the possibility of exploring development of a specialized supplemental survey, right? That would be more focused on the snapper grouper component of the fishery. And knowing that is a big lift, right, from different perspectives. I was thinking, John, would it be possible, for us to work with MRIP program and the Office of Science and Technology? And if you're willing to basically land use, right, of that pool of statistical consultants, so go through a process where perhaps a working group can be formed that would be working with the consultants in exploring, possible scenarios for the use of different approaches that perhaps could be used with different groups of species. So the more common species, and this is in, John Carmichael's summary there, for the more common species that are easier to cover through a survey, there will be this supplemental survey that hopefully would be completely compatible, right, and tie into supplemental to MRIP. But for other species that are not as common, rare event species that are not as easily sampled through a general survey, you could develop some additional processes, right, that would be taking care of those types of fisheries. But in that discussion with the consultants, this working group could potentially explore development of some approaches, and then we could move on and see what's the possibility of pilot testing some of these approaches for a couple, 3 years, so we have some data there to help inform the steps going forward.
All right. John, do you want to opine about that?
And sorry, John, don't mean to put you on the spot there, but since we're brainstorming on how we can operationalize some of these ideas here.
Sure. So that, all of that, Luis, that all sounds very reasonable, a reasonable approach forward. And, just as a general statement, yes, that is exactly that's well within the scope of what the MRIP consultants, are available to work on. At this point, of course, I can't make a firm commitment until we know, have a good sense of the scope and on their time and things like that. But yeah, I think, clearly we can figure it out. I think it's just the details again about exactly what would be needed and what that would equate to in terms of the funding that we have available to support the consultants.
Luis, just to make sure I'm grasping this correctly, and I may not be. So would the permit need to be in place and functional before you do the pilots, or not?
Well, if that is something that is, a big part of this, the way that we're discussing, yeah, we could put something in place, right, on perhaps a testing basis, right, something that would be developed to allow implementation of these pilot studies.
Okay,
But if that makes sense.
Yeah, because one other idea that's sort of floating around out there is, instead of trying to eat the entire elephant that is the snapper grouper complex at one time, is the possibility of going to what we would all define as deep water species, and in using the deep water species as sort of a pilot, recognizing that obviously the effort prosecuted for them is not necessarily representative of the overall effort prosecuted on the rest of the complex. But anyway, that's kind of what I was thinking. But anyway, I'll go to you, Eric, and then we can.
Yeah, thanks, Spud. So you guys actually touched on the subject I wanted to bring up next, and that is funding matters for this in many, many ways. So, obviously the council can push for a regulatory change to require a permit, and that is essentially cost neutral, or whatever it takes to run the database, which actually is not totally cost neutral. But what I'm concerned is that one of the statements you made, Spud, was that, well, if we just get the permit, that's going to improve things. But that's not entirely true. The science part of it is going to cost money. There's no two ways about it. I mean, even if it is just John's shop having to just analyze the data and determine maybe a shifting in sampling allocation or something like that, those are big scientific efforts. And you're talking about changing a survey that's been ongoing for a really long time, and you want to be very careful about making any changes to it without going through all the testing and all of that. So I just want to make sure we don't ignore the other part of the puzzle, which is get the permit in place, but then get the funding to do the science with that permit database. And that's a pretty costly endeavor, depending on how much we want to do with that database. So like Luis was alluding to, ginning up a whole new program based on this permit, that's a great idea, but that's, you start getting pretty expensive pretty quick.
All right, thanks, Eric. Yeah, and I guess, the point I was trying to get across is that, when the council looks at this, it's going to be a relatively simple decision. Are we, if we do what's within the scope of authority of the council, which is to, amend the snapper grouper plan to require a permit of some form and fashion, will there be the concomitant efforts to make that permit actually produce the desired outcome? And I guess what I heard is that it would help even with MRIP in its current design and APIS as it's currently designed and executed, it would help. Because I think that's, is that paragraph I read from that report said it's a cost-benefit analysis. Before we put a burden back on the fishing community, is the benefits going to equal or outweigh that the cost to the fishing community, the cost to the agencies, all of the costs, both overt and sort of covert, that go along with this. All right, Luis.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Eric, to that point, which I think is a valid one, that obviously this is going to have cost associated with it, and depending on what kind of program we're talking about, that cost may be significant. However, I think that if we handle this by putting together a plan for what we would like to see, within reason, of course, and this is why I think that us working with the MRIP team and working through their consultants and having sort of a working group type of process, so we can think through a lot of these details and try and measure how much is enough and how much is too much. I think we could come up with something that's reasonable, that that reasonable plan, then if after we have that in place, it's just a matter of approaching the right people involved, right, in the appropriations process. And I think that an example of this, right, is Seafire that we saw, discussions that were had perhaps 10 years ago, started discussions of things that at the time were basically seen as aspirational, right? Well, the councils formalized their request and worked with the agency, and an appropriation was made to address this, and the program now is in a testing phase of implementation, as a side-by-side with MRIP, and changes may or may not, happen with the way that the survey, data collection for that sector, the for-hire sector electronic reporting is done as a result of this testing phase. But I think that having something that we want to present as a viable solution and a way forward will be the first step, keeping in mind that, right, if we design something that is too large and too expensive, it's not going to be implementable because it's not realistic.
Eric, I'll call on you.
Yeah, and just in follow up to that, no, I agree. The better we can kind of spell out what the intended use of this permit is, the better. And I would even say that just for the sake of, I don't know, I don't understand the political waters on this, on how well this would be supported or not in terms of putting a permit in place, but it would be good to probably bracket it in the sense of, if we don't get much extra funding, but we at least get the permit, here's what we could do with it. If we had a lot more funding, here's where we could take that permit in terms of data collection and survey improvements, and have maybe just a low and a high, so to speak. And I think it probably helps to sell this to, the public that, hey, these are the potential benefits. We don't know, because if anybody can predict funding, boy, I'd like to understand your predictive model. But I think that just helps in communicating this.
All right, thanks. Before I go to you, Bev, I just want to maybe set a little context for this, how we're looking forward into an uncertain future. And that is, and Jessica and John, I'll lean on you, but let's just say theoretically that we come out of this meeting with a recommendation back to the council to use Amendment 46 as an instrument to carry forward a recommendation to create a permit in the South Atlantic snapper grouper fishery for some aggregate of species, deep water, subset, or whatever form it might take. It will take us, what, at least 2 years probably before that permit was actually in place and effective. This maybe it would help the group if we have a little context, because that has some bearing on, what Luis is talking about with, working with consultants to develop, pilot testing of specialized surveys and that kind of thing. So I appreciate y'all's input on that.
Are you ready? Are you waiting for me, or are you waiting for someone to respond to what?
Well, I'm ready for either John or Jessica, if you want to respond to that. I see your hands raised. That's fine.
Yeah, so to respond to that, I think, so there already is the amendment in the queue that's been just sitting out there, I think since maybe even before you were on the council, Spud. And so I think we could pick that back up and restart this process. But you're right, and maybe this is a Myra question. I can't remember if we've already pulled that previous amendment back into the queue on the priority list, but then after it starts moving, you're right, are we at a year? Are we at a year and a half? Based on all the complexities that might get suggested, I don't know if that slows it down or if some of that gets figured out afterward. Maybe that's really a Myra question.
Certainly, anybody who can inform that would be welcome to talk.
Hi, Spud. So this is Myra, and Jessica is correct. The amendment 46, has been tentatively resurrected, so it's moved up in your work plan, pending, recommendations from this work group and how the council wants to handle moving forward. And as I always say, an amendment takes as long as however many actions are included in there. Certainly a permit program could take a little while to put in place. So I think, Spud, you were right in your estimation of possibly 2 years before something could be in place. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Well, I think that sort of helps frame up the discussion about the other things that might need to take place to optimize the value of the permit. We obviously all are aware of the struggles that have gone on with the for-hire reporting and full implementation of that. So, okay, Bev, thanks for your patience.
No problem. Kind of along those lines, I was going to make the point that the permit plays a pretty big role in how you design a survey around it. That's certainly our experience in Florida. When we developed the state reef fish permit, we had to address a lot of issues with oversubscription. There's a big decision point whether it's angler-based or boat-based permit, and that impacts how you integrate it with MRIP or how you design the the field validation part. So wouldn't wait. I'm assuming you guys would have to do a bunch of public hearings and stuff to flesh out how that permit's going to be set up, but that is going to play a big role in how you design something around it. Knowing what subset of species or if it's a if it's a full suite of species, all those things would be pretty important before you dive into how you're going to use that permit to develop a survey.
Right. Good points. Thank you, Val. All right, Louise?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, just briefly. Quick question for John. John, you may not remember this off the top of your head. I definitely don't, so I thought that you might. I mean, there was a point, right, when there was implementation of MRFs way back when that started, where the private recreational sector and the for-hire sectors, if I remember correctly, were all together, part of one single survey. And over time, folks looking into this and the MRIP program looking into this realized that designing a specialized survey for the for-hire sector, which became the for-hire survey that we have in place right now, was advisable because that general survey wasn't really being as efficient and effective for both the private recreational and the for-hire sectors being covered under a single survey. So what I'm thinking here is that what we're discussing is along the same thought processes, right? That, if we feel that there is a component of the fisheries now that even though it's being properly sampled by the general MRIP survey now, could have significant improvements in precision, right? Perhaps timeliness or other components. If a specialized survey is developed, that this, could fall along those same types of ideas or processes. Do you remember that how that process took place, John? Or are you aware of that history? Because you're not around, I think, when that happened.
Well, if Louise, if you're referring to the effort survey, the Coastal Household Telephone Survey, yes, it prior to, I'll just say 2004, it varied between the Gulf and the Atlantic, but yeah, the effort estimates for the for-hire modes came from the Coastal Household Telephone Survey, as did the private boat and shore mode effort estimates. And yes, you're right, that that design was very inefficient, covering coastal counties only. It was very inefficient for charter effort because, not surprisingly, most of the anglers in that mode aren't necessarily living in coastal counties of coastal states. So yes, the for-hire survey, the telephone survey, separate telephone survey was developed for that purpose. I would say, with respect to this situation, there could be a number of, thinking just of the effort component. There could be a number of options. There could be an entirely separate component survey developed, or there's the option for perhaps additional stratification within the existing FES if the permit were in place. Now, creating the new strata would be relatively straightforward, but we would need almost certainly additional sample to fully realize the value of those additional strata to produce precise estimates, for this fleet, and also be able to, in the intercept survey, additional sample sizes to provide a robust and accurate coverage adjustment for any activity not covered by the permit universe.
Any follow-up, Luis? Are you good?
No, thank you, Spud. I'm good. Thank you for that, John. I mean, that helps, right? As think about all of this. So yes, thank you, John.
All right, thank you. All right, Jeff, and then I'll go to you, Mel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for the conversation here. This really is helpful, and if you guys would kind of indulge me by scrolling back up under item 1, preliminary recommendations, that second paragraph. My suggestion here is, there was really good discussion about what does that permit creation bring, and that's the majority of the paragraph. But I suggest we separate the dedicated sampling similar to MRIP LPS into its own paragraph, so that we kind of separate and capture this idea of create the permit, leave that on its own, and then a new item that would suggest this new permit could be used to enhance or modify effort surveys and develop new sampling similar to either MRIP LPS, which is captured on screen, or, in my memory of our last meeting, another option was that kind of Florida SURFs approach. And I don't know if the work group wants to include kind of both options in that recommendation. But I think separating the permit from the additional sampling in the group recommendation would be, it has been discussed already. I just wanted to kind of capture it in the piece. And then I guess before I stop, I would say maybe consider a new recommendation there, which is, continuously monitor, and I put it in the chat window for staff to help, but continuously monitor the impacts of 2021 increased APIS sampling on estimate precision and resolution. So I'll say it again because what's written is close, but it's continuously monitor the impacts of 2021 forward increased APIS sampling on estimate precision and resolution.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Good suggestions. Have we got that captured, you think, satisfactory?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, very good. All right, Mr. Chairman, go right ahead.
Well, thanks, Bud, for the opportunity to weigh in here a little bit. I think when you kind of started talking about timing and mechanisms for potential implementation, I had flashbacks to the for hire reporting amendment and the eventual after that was finally passed and approved, and then the implementation time for that. I just wanted to, the 2 years, as Myra said, again, the simpler you keep an amendment. If we do use resurrected Amendment 46 as a pathway, the simpler we make that, the better in terms of moving it through. But I think we just need to make sure we're going to go that route, we go into it eyes wide open, realizing that we need to be in, everybody needs to be on board with, with how we're going to, once we get this established, the time frame for getting it up and running operationally. And, I know we had some kind of delays when we went down when we implemented the for hire reporting amendment. There were, necessary delays in getting things up and running. But what I'm just want to make sure that we're always aware of is public perception, public understanding of what we're doing. And I want to be sure that we don't create expectations from the public, that we're not going to be able to meet. So we just need to make sure as we move through this, if we go that route, that there's a clear intent to bring such a permit online, to make it operational, to make it useful as quickly as possible, and that we've made sure we have the resources necessary to do that. So there's no surprises about, well, we don't, have the money to do this particular thing. But I'm just, trying to learn from a recent lesson in terms of the bringing the for hire reporting on board. And I know it's not the same thing exactly, but there are the public, in some respects, is still smarting a little bit from some of that, because it's not quite up and in the condition that we had hoped it would be as quickly as we hoped it would be, for a lot of reasons. And so if we go down this route with a permit, and as folks have said, great, we can establish a permit. I think there's obviously public support for a permit, because we keep hearing about it, regardless of the meeting we're in or the report that we receive. There seems to be broad support for this concept of improving data through a better, a more manageable universe of anglers, and whether that's for specific species or the snapper grouper complex. But I think we've got support, and we want to make sure we if we're going to utilize that support and move forward with something like this, we do it with a commitment to make sure that we're going to make this thing work as quickly as we can in a way that really results in some benefits, which is what folks are looking for, which is the improved data and what would result from that. So just I think you're discussing timelines. Maybe think about that a little bit. And I just had that sort of brief flashback to the for hire reporting amendment and follow on actions required to get it up and running and actually operational, and for us to eventually achieve benefits from it. So we just need to keep that in mind as we move forward. And I think, perhaps Amendment 46 is would be a reasonable mechanism to move in that direction. So thanks for letting me weigh in there.
Well, thank you, Mel. And I mean, you articulated a lot of the things that have been weighing on me about this, and that is, managing expectations. And there are a lot of people who believe that creating and requiring a permit in the snapper grouper fishery is going to remedy some of the chronic problems we've had. And, there's nothing worse than implementing something like that and it never bearing the fruit that you want it to. And it's because then it's hard to undo what you've already done. And I guess that's what I keep trying to get at is, we don't control the NIMS budget. We don't control the MRIP program priorities, allocation of human and fiscal resources. I mean, we try to influence it at the council level as best we can, and I think we have a good relationship, and we're all working towards the same goals. But there are certain realities, and so I'm just trying to think of, how do we synchronize our activities here to maximize the potential for success? And it gets back to what Louise is talking about is, if we're looking at I suppose in our amendment, we could put in a date certain for implementation, and it could be a 2-year horizon, a 3-year horizon, whatever it may be, to allow the adequate time to have the other compatible parts of this process take place, whether it be a work group to design, a specialized survey pilot project that could be implemented once the permit is in place, whatever it may be. That's what I'm trying to make sure that we, as best we can, come out of this with, because when we put this into the form of an amendment, then obviously there's going to be a whole nother set of discussions and the how and the why and the when that we're going to need to sort of work our way through at the council level. So, but thanks for that. Okay, let's see here. Where are we at? Good discussions. All right, Chester, go ahead.
Thank you, Spud. Excuse me. There's been a lot of discussion about implementation and the funding that might be necessary for implementation. I don't think, and I of course could be very wrong, but I don't think that at the legislative level that there would be a lot of problem with regard to getting some funding for this particular program. You've got a lot of recreational industry lobbyists who I think would be very supportive of this and would push it. On the other side, certain NGOs in the past have fought against some of the things that the recreational folks have wanted, but when it comes to getting better data, I think they'd be on board as well. So if we take our sort of like our first bite at the elephant, I think what we need to do is get this stamp in place and get it funded, or get it funded and get it in place, and do that before we go off on, what kind of survey are we going to set up that might be based on this stamp, because the initial idea, and something that a number of people on the council and some of the recreational advocacy groups have been saying for literally for years now, we've got to define the universe, because when you start trying to take, particularly with regard to some of these limited encounter species, when you take those intercepts and you find one and you then extrapolate across the entire recreational sector, you get wacko results. So we need to be able to say, okay, the people that actually go offshore and bottom fish, that section or that universe of people is approximately, and then have some sort of, within the magnitude of a number, so that you're not extrapolating so much. And that is what I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Chester. All right, John Carmichael.
Yeah, thank you, Spud. And I'm going to say, I think the group's having some great discussion here on this, and we are getting to some information that's really going to help the council deal with this. And as we know, in the council, we get to the amendment, we're going to have alternatives. We're going to have to consider a range of alternatives. And I feel like this discussion has really helped start to map that out, what that might look like in terms of the range. And then the council obviously has to evaluate its goals and objectives against the cost and benefits, the impact to the fishermen, all the stuff that's discussed of those different approaches. And so kind of hearing last few comments here, and Chester sort of gave me an idea. I'm thinking about, maybe there's a way that this could go forward, just to kind of think of an idea that the permit goes in, potentially covers all snapper grouper, because we talked about, clearly, and we've heard from the permit folks that surveying is tied to permitting. They're not separate decisions. What you can do in survey to a large extent is going to depend on what you can do with permit. We see what we can do when there's no permit, and we've come to the realization that really targeting people who aren't identified in a UVerse is extremely expensive, beyond our means. So we're here talking about permits to try to address that. So there's potentially a route where permits cover snapper grouper fishing, and then there's different types of surveying that goes in within that, because not all snapper grouper fishing is created the same, whether it's for the species, for the depth, for the latitude across our region. So, Spud, earlier you mentioned deep water species. So there's a potential scenario perhaps where, if you want to fish for snapper grouper, if you want to possess anything in the snapper grouper complex, you have this permit. If you want to fish and possess for deep water species, you have this endorsement for deep water, call it, and you report. Perhaps you do a census style logbook reporting for that. Perhaps other components of it, you are covered by more of a LPS style survey where you focus in on a particular segment of the fishery. And then perhaps for the most prevalent ones where you're dealing primarily with species that are well sampled under MRIP, I'm thinking of stuff like black sea bass, which are throughout the region and encountered by lots of people, which means encountered by lots of APIS and APIS effort, not FES, but APIS effort. Then perhaps the existing MRIP with some of the improvements that were talked about could be possible even from just having a permit might work for those species. So, I think we should keep in mind that it could be a continuum of survey approaches within a single permit. And I think in doing that, one concern we should bear in mind also is we need to provide the fishermen some benefit. It will be some time before we get better data, as we all know. And I added that comment there about it could potentially take not just the time to get it implemented, but think about the for hire changes. The FES changes and the need to do side-by-side comparison. Comments earlier about the impacts of changing a survey. So that could add some time. And I think we want to make sure that when the fishermen bear whatever cost, whether it's time or energy or money to get a permit, that they are quickly starting to see some type of return on that investment and they see changes. I think one thing we do have to guard against is, if we put in a permit and then say data collection and we'll look at that down the road, we could face a backlash from folks. So I think it's important that we try to put this together as a package as much as we can. So thanks for that opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, John. I appreciate that. That's a good, good sort of reset on our context for this. I kind of look at this, it's like, why do you want to saddle if you don't have a horse? Everything has to go together. What I'm struggling with is how do we within our authority ensure that the suite of various surveys to maximize the outcome of the permit are explored and developed and then executed in a timely manner so that the permit doesn't just sit out there as the saddle while we're continuing to go wrangle up a horse somewhere. So, hi, John Foster.
Sorry, I'm still muted. Just wanted to follow on to the idea of potentially having multiple designs that make use of the permit, where the designs are applied separately to different suites of species, potentially depending on their rareness or encounter rates. That's certainly a reasonable approach. However, a consideration there is different designs often bring with them, as we've learned over the years, the potential for different levels of non-sampling error. And can't get into specifics because it's all very case specific to the designs that are in play. But so it could take additional time, to the extent it's needed to explore those. Again, if different designs are utilized, in particular, if there is a need to have the estimates that are produced for those different suites of species be comparable, amongst themselves or across the species that are covered by the different designs. So again, just another consideration, with that sort of a multi-design approach.
Yeah, thanks, John. So I guess I'll maybe bounce this back to you, John Carmichael, or whoever would like to respond to it. Is how do we, within Amendment 46, address the need for development of the surveys to maximize the efficacy of the permit? Is that within the purview of an amendment to do that? I wasn't there when the for-hire amendment was developed, and frankly, I haven't read all the language in it, but I'm just curious as how do we influence that part of the process to ensure that the horse and the saddle all end up in the same place at the same time?
Yeah, well, Spud, I believe that since the council is directed under Magnuson essentially to specify the data that's required, the information that's needed for management, I think that does give the council the authority to require particular things for data collection purposes. So to me, that gives us the opportunity to consider all of the types of things that we are talking about. And I do want to say, I think John Foster made a really good point there, which I totally agree with that. And, as we get into more complexity, that is going to add potentially more time. And it may very well create some situations, depending on how you approached reporting and permitting, that, the estimates for one species may not be comparable to estimates for another species. And while that's true, I think, to some extent, those of you who have looked at the quality of the estimates for a lot of, say, the really rare species, I think we kind of know to some extent that's probably happening now. So, but it is something we do have to consider, and I think all this could be worked out within the council amendment process. I think the key seems to be, Spud, having potentially actions and alternatives that address both the permitting as well as the associated data collection that would support it. And as long as it's going back to, what's the council's goals, what's the purpose and need for doing this, I think the council's within its right to consider this kind of stuff. But we have to go through all of those steps in developing an FMP to get there. And we know that's a lot, but it would make us talk about most of the things that have been put on the table here this afternoon.
All right, thanks, John. Well, then I'll pose this to the work group that to accomplish what I believe we all agree needs to happen as a result of a permit. Does it need to be at the vessel level or the individual level? Because I think at the individual level, but I think I'd like some discussion on that, because I think that's going to be obviously that's a pretty fundamental part of this whole process. Is, are we going to require this for individuals or for vessels? So I'd like some feedback on that. Anybody? Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I think Bev raised this issue earlier, and it's a good one. And I think, like it or not, the recreational data collection world has focused on the individual at this point. And I see no reason to deviate from that with this. Everything seems to be centered around the individual angler. Whether if we could take a magic wand and go all the way back to the beginning, if we'd still design it that way, I don't know. But the reality is, if we really want to make the most of this and integrate it to some degree with existing sampling designs, you pretty much are stuck with the individual angler level.
All right, thanks. Anybody else? Chester?
Yeah, I was going to point out that the Florida system is based on an individual. Every individual on the boat has to have the permit or endorsement, whatever it is. But then again, HMS, that's done by the boat. And I think they've had some success with it. It certainly would be simpler. You would contact the person that took out the permit, probably the owner of the boat. So I just throw that out. I don't have any great preference one way or the other, but there are examples of doing it by boat.
All right, thanks, Chester. All right, John Foster.
Yeah, thanks. I would, building off of Eric's comment, yes, everything, the MRIP in terms of the general survey estimates is structured around angler trip. That said, a vessel-based permit could still be incorporated, either as the stratification idea I mentioned previously, or with a supplemental survey effort or otherwise. And again, one of the key, there are trade-offs going either way, but one of I think the benefits of the vessel permit is it's a bit more straightforward in the intercept survey component to collect information that can determine if that vessel is permitted or not. And this again gets into some of the non-sampling errors that can affect survey estimates that are somewhat more difficult to quantify compared to just sampling error coming from sample sizes primarily. So I would just suggest, I'll just speak personally. I think the vessel-based permit on whole, or on, considering everything would be what I would suggest, you consider. But again, it's a trade-off consideration. There are costs to going that way, and there are certainly some benefits to going the angler-based permit route.
All right, thanks, John. Bev?
I think John covered everything I was going to say. That would be problematic for Florida, though, since we already have an angler-based survey methodology, but we don't want to be obstacles in this process for sure. But yeah, originally we were thinking about a vessel-based as well. And I think when this went out for kind of public input, that's when we were kind of swayed towards the angler-based licensing. And I wasn't as involved in that as some other people here. But yeah, I think all the points that John made about the simplicity of a vessel-based approaches, those are good points.
All right, thanks. Anyone else? It sounds like that a permit at the individual angler level would probably be okay. Amy, go ahead.
Thanks, Bud. This discussion has been really enlightening. I thank everybody for their comments, and I agree with a lot of the comments that have been said so far. I kind of want to go back to Eric's approach, where he was talking about the high and low expectations with regards to data use, money management, because your question about vessel versus individual is going to apply to what he was saying. Can the Cerro Permit Office handle an individual permit process, or would it be more feasible, financially acceptable, maybe a faster time process to go to a boat-based, especially after what John just said, making it being applicable? You might be able to have these strategies for stratification. Just again, it's that thought process of making sure that if you guys go down this path as a council to implement a permit, that the idea of its use, its validation components, it's being helpful for science and management all have to be at the forefront. The last thing that we need to do is to lose our audience before we've even had an opportunity to gain them. And if the amendment is started, is it almost too late? Are we putting kind of that cart before the horse, to kind of use your own words, Spud, negatively against us? And just to bring it to the table, I don't think we can share it yet, but Chip Collier and I are, and Richard Cody has been intricately involved. There's a new MAFAC electronic reporting task force that's currently working. And a lot of the things that you guys are talking about are, again, part of what is going on. It's a group that is trying to generate, deliver usable electronic platforms for the private recreational anglers to self-report the data. This might be a little different. It might be a required data, but a lot of the same tools in the toolbox are being discussed, making sure that the data is usable, that it's high quality, that it's accurate data, and things like talking about the data gaps that are needed, creating common standards and data integration, angler recruitment. All of this is being discussed, and again, I got to make sure we can share it, but at some point it would be really nice to share that draft document that a lot of us have been working on to this working group, because a lot of the information is applicable.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. I'm glad you brought that up, because that is a completely different but very important element of how do we collect data from the private recreational sector. Obviously, we all know from the Modern Fish Act and from what you hear within the recreational fishing community, that people see that, you know, self-reporting through electronic means is believed to be the way of the future, and should be fully integrated into our more traditional ways. But I guess, you know, and I do think we need to benefit from continuing to understand how it can be used. And I kind of liken this back to when we were wrestling with the sending devices. You know, and we said, well, if we don't make them mandatory, we'll never be able to try to quantify their use. And so I think some of us struggle with that. I know I did. And so, you know, if you have, you know, voluntary self-reporting, which certainly has a place, how does that complement or get integrated into something that may be mandatory? But anyway, that's a good point. Thank you for bringing that up. Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize because I'm kind of raising a quandary without a solution, but I think this choice of a vessel or individual permit base is relevant to discuss, because traditionally the federal entities permit a vessel. That is true for the reptile fish. It's true for HMS, and the state fisheries tend to permit the individual, and that permit type choice alone might impact which kind of surveys approaches would work. So what works for HMS and LPS intercept surveys as a boat-based permit may not work when the Florida approach is an individual-based permit and an individual-based follow-up survey. And I would defer to John and Emrip and the survey brains of how all that works, but that kind of alignment of this work group making a recommendation for a type of permit that still has an unknown solution of what kind of follow-up survey would go with it. I think the permit and the survey type may need to be paired.
Go ahead, John. I'll let you respond to that.
Sure, thanks. So, you know, again, I don't want to get too far into technical details on this, but, you know, it is entirely possible within the existing surveys to make use of vessel-based permit information. Yes, we interview individual anglers in APIS, in the intercept survey, but those anglers within a boat party are linked together, identified together. And so it would be having the vessel-based permit would essentially be associated with all of those anglers. Some identification of that in the intercept data would be identified for all of the anglers fishing aboard that vessel. Shifting to the fishing effort survey for effort, mail-based survey. Again, that's a household, it produces effort for as individual angler trips, but the sample units are households. So there's multiple anglers nested potentially within the individual sample unit. And by having a vessel-based permit, so long as that vessel permit has associated contact information, including address potentially, or hopefully, it would still be able to flag households on the FES sample frame as to whether or not it's a household that's associated with the vessel permit, but still be able to produce angler trip estimates within that domain as permitted or not permitted. So I won't get any more details than that, but then of course, none of that rules out the option for a specialized survey as well that's permit based. But again, that's just sort of a high level sketch of how a vessel-based permit could still be incorporated into the existing surveys that, as Eric and others have pointed out, Eric and Jeff are angler. The analysis unit is an angler trip.
Thanks, John. That is extremely helpful and certainly makes me think differently about the utility of a vessel-based system. Now, I'll put our Florida colleagues on the spot here, because obviously we want to be sensitive to the fact that Florida, invested effort and energy into creating a state level refish survey to try to improve the data that's available for managing snapper grouper. So, and this can be Jessica, Bev, whoever, Chester, whoever would like to respond to it. But if there were a federal level vessel-based snapper grouper permit created and required, how is that going to impact your efforts in Florida? And obviously, this is not binding by any means. I'm just curious because at the individual level, there could probably be some sort of exemption created, if you had an individual level permitting. But I'd like some thoughts on that. Chester?
Yeah, I don't see how you would do I'm thinking back when we put in the saltwater permit at the federal level, and then if you met certain criteria at the state level and what the state was requiring for its saltwater licenses, you were exempted. And I don't remember that we did anything in that. I think that was all 100% individual permits. I think it would be up to the FWC of how they might want to change, if necessary, their requirements here. But I'm not sure that we should make this decision right now, even if it's in the form of a recommendation. I think that we need to say, okay, we've gone around and round about this, and we really believe that some sort of a stamp or endorsement at the federal level issued by the federal government is necessary. And then we can have different options that we've discussed so that the council can discuss them, perhaps maybe with better information than what we've got right now, but can discuss them to see whether we think we ought to go on the vessel level or the individual level.
All right, thanks, Chester. Bev, I'll call on you.
Yeah, I don't want to make any promises on the spot here, but I'd like to give this some thought. If there were this additional permit out there that we could somehow integrate it into our current survey, we'd be willing to talk to some statisticians about how we might try to do that. I'm not sure it's a deal breaker for us. I don't have a firm idea how we would do it yet, but I think we could come up with a creative way to maybe incorporate that into our current survey.
Thanks. Yeah, and to get back to what Chester was saying, obviously the recommendation to the council doesn't have to be absolutely prescriptive, but I do think that we're going to, in order for the council to have a fully informed discussion about preferences for alternatives, we really need to be able to say, if we chose a vessel-based permit, then it would allow us to do these things perhaps more expediently than we can with an individual permit, or if we choose what are the pros and cons of each one. And I think that's something we'll have to grapple with, at the council level. But anyway, just John, I'll tell you what, let me go to Amy, and then maybe we'll take a break and ruminate on that a little bit and come back. So thanks, Amy, for your patience.
Absolutely, Spud. I honestly just wanted to say I'm sitting here in my office, completely squirming in my chair with excitement, because John Foster said if we properly design a program, then we can use a vessel to report instead of an individual. And I was just ecstatic with that. So thank you for saying that. And kind of a follow-up, I was going to ask Bev, are you already collecting or matching vessels to your individual reef endorsements in Florida? Or is that not something you're currently doing?
Yeah, if they have a vessel registered in the state of Florida, we use that database as part of our survey stratification. So yeah, we do know who lives in a house with a boat and who that boat is registered to.
Awesome, thank you.
Thanks. Tell you what, Luis, I'll go to you, and then we'll take a break.
Thank you, Spud. And real briefly, and back to the points that Chester made, I agree completely. I mean, I thought that the idea here would be that we would develop some recommendations on a number of potential options, right? And develop sort of like a plan, a conceptual like list of potential options. And this, right, the council would then decide on whether it wants to proceed and go forward in pursuing those options. And then it would develop some more detail, like similar to what happened with the IPTs now, right? So the council can consider conceptually some fishery regulations that is thinking about implementing, but then there's a more technically oriented group that's going to have to work out all the details and see the pros and cons and develop all the analysis that's needed to inform which one of those options is best. So I was not thinking about getting all of those details worked out here, and thinking that if our council follows this same kind of process, and we can tap into the MRIP program and their pool of consultants, they would have then a more technically oriented basis to start investigating what will be the possible scenarios, and then how to have those, pilot tested.
Yeah, thanks. And I think, that's certainly a prudent and responsible course of action. I think we do have to acknowledge that will probably extend the timeline. And this is certainly too important to do it in a hurried fashion and not, again, maximize our chances for success. But that's just something I have to think of, that the more supporting analyses there have to be for options, then, this could stretch us out to a little bit different timeline. So anyway, okay, well, thanks for that. Let's take a break and come back at, let's just make it 5 after 3:05. I'll give everybody plenty of time for a little break.
work group members, as you return, can you please raise your hand so we can see when everybody gets back? Just a reminder for work group members to raise your hand as you return so we can see when everybody gets back. Okay, Mr. Chair, it looks like we have pretty much everyone back.
All right, thank you, Chip. All right, we'll, continue on with our discussion. It sounds like that the recommendation to the council will be to consider a vessel-based and an individual-based permit. And, you know, it'll be, I guess, the IPT's responsibility / burden to flesh out the pros and cons of those two, so that the council can give them the full consideration as we move through the amendment. So just, I guess this is for Myra, John, and Chip, and all of you. I mean, what do you think, having to fully explore the pros and cons of both of them may do in terms of required timing? Just, you know, again, nothing binding, just, I'm just curious.
Well, but I definitely think it's going to take a fair amount of time to work through this, as it does with any permitting and reporting situation. But I'm optimistic that the efforts of this group and the discussion we've had will certainly help accelerate the process. We've come up with a lot of ideas, a lot of things to consider, a lot of approaches that could be applied. So I feel like we're in a good position to put together maybe packages of actions and alternatives that the council should consider. You know, I think it's clear we need to probably address this vessel or individual situation pretty early on. I try to do a few things here just to refine our recommendations a bit, because, you know, I think getting the vessel or individual needs to be put in there. It sounded like a slight lean toward vessel, perhaps, as we ended the time before the break. But, you know, obviously, as with all of these things, you know, anything stated here in a recommendation doesn't alleviate the need of the council to fully explore the ranges of actions and alternatives that are necessary to comply with Magnuson and NEPA. So just stuff here doesn't preclude any of that, but I do think it's important to get that in there. And I thought perhaps we had the recommendation line about sampling similar to MRIP LPS, but it really sounds like, based on the discussion today, that these next two bullets probably capture that better. That council really needs to look at a range of reporting requirements, from census to surveys to really just incorporating the new permit information into existing surveys, and that it could consider multiple approaches across this fishery that we have, considering its variety. And I think it also, within this, the council will have to look at, you know, how that then factors into the individual species and how the catch estimates are performing historically, as well as predictions for the future with things like the increased sampling. If increased sampling has helped some of this, we may have some species that maybe are in line to be able to have their estimates further improved from some of these simpler approaches. So, you know, I think this captures where the group wants to go. How much time it will take, again, will really come down to how quick the council can make decisions, the quality of information, I guess, we can put out there, and how much stuff kind of pops up along the way as we start working on it that we haven't thought of. But I think with this group and the expertise that we've had and the experience from the states and the feds across the board have probably put us in a good position to at least know the challenges that we have to work on. The vessel individual, as I said, I think the compatibility with Florida, which I got down in the other bullets, is also an important issue that we know we have to address, you know, going in. I also added something, Spud, here, and we can look through these some more too, research and data recommendations. But during the break, thought about this idea of, you know, side-by-side survey efforts. As mentioned earlier, that was a big part of moving to FES and making the calibration of the past MRIP to the new MRIP. So if we were to do something like a deep water endorsement and require a logbook, that's going to be a substantial change, and that's probably going to require some calibration efforts. So That would affect implementation timing, probably factor into a lot of the pilots that were talked about, but it may not necessarily affect the council's time to get it in. So, but I do think that's the kind of stuff that we should be thinking about, because we do need to be prepared for this, particularly if we take heed of the very good advice about managing expectations. I think that's, that's super important. There's a lot riding on this, and recreational anglers do have a lot of expectations for improved data, and we don't want to just be giving lip service to this. We want to make sure we're honest and upfront about how long it's going to take, what's going to be necessary, and what the potential benefits are.
Yeah, thanks, John. I'm gonna go to Bev, and then I've got something that I almost hesitate to bring up, but I'm gonna throw it out there because it's another bone we need to chew on. So go ahead, Bev.
That doesn't sound good. I was actually gonna throw out there too, speaking about reporting requirements, one of the biggest challenges with surveys is non-response, and whether there's bias in those people who respond and don't respond. So it might be worth considering an option for, even if it's a survey, that you have some language in the rule or the regulation that says if you're selected for a survey, you're required to report.
All right, thanks. Good point. So I guess here's something that I want to bring up. I don't know that it would ever occur, but I'm sort of thinking, would there be a point in the future where we would actually have a hybrid approach where we would have a vessel permit and an individual permit? And I think about waterfowling. When we go back to waterfowling a lot, you have certain states where a guide has to be licensed, but that doesn't absolve the individual hunter from having a federal duck stamp. And so I guess, that doesn't have to be solved right now, but I just wonder if that's something that should be contemplated going forward. Because if you wanted if you had a group of people that were, like, let's just say, that are targeting the deep water folks, are you going to capture that with a vessel, or would you want to do some sort of individual endorsement that would also work with the vessel? So anyway, I just throw that out there. Something. Chester.
Thank you, Spud. I don't know that we need to be worried about that, because right now, I just take the state of Florida. You're going out saltwater fishing, you got to have a saltwater fishing license. And the stamp, if you will, or whatever, the endorsement is a state requirement. So what we're talking about here is a federal endorsement or a federal permit issued by the feds. The program is paid for by the feds. And so I think we would do well to, the more I've thought about this, to conform to sort of the requirements, I'll use that word, of the feds in other areas like HMS, and I think I heard blue line tilefish or something, that it's a per vessel. Now, states want to then, on top of that, and have more precision, and they want to require, like Florida does right now, and they've got an individual permit. I think that's up to the states. So, because they're the ones that would be issuing those. So I think we're okay on that. I really do.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess another question I'll ask is, and is this again within the purview of the council to recommend whether it's cost or no cost? Is that something that'll fall within the purview of the council's action?
My understanding, Spud, is if it's a federal permit, they can only recoup the cost of administering the permit under the current law.
Okay.
So that would take some other change if the council were to get in that. So in the past, that's been something the council doesn't get involved in.
But that'll be something that the service will need to provide input back to the council as they deliberate, right?
Yeah,
so that
they
the council
probably
members
would.
will know.
Oh,
You know,
mhm.
I believe that isn't the HMS. The HMS permit, I haven't had one in a couple of years, but I think it was $25 or something like that, I think, for the vessel. Is the tilefish permit, does it have a cost or is it no cost? Does anybody know?
Believe the Mid-Atlantic's one is no cost, but I could be wrong about that.
Okay. All right.
If there is
Just
cost,
curious.
it's low because see, they can't make money off a permit like a state can. That's the ruling.
Right. Okay. All right. All right. So what else are we missing here, John and Myra and Chip from this discussion that needs to be captured in recommendations back to the council? I guess one question I'll follow that with is, and this is Luis has made reference to this, having a working, I guess, a standing working group that will develop pilot studies to determine the efficacy of various survey designs and methods. And is this group perhaps augmented with some other members at group going forward? I'd open that up to anybody, not just John C., but anybody that has thoughts on that.
Is this kind of what we have in mind, perhaps a technical working group to help guide pilot studies?
Well, I'll go back to Luis because he's the one that sort of mentioned this, and maybe Luis can help explain his vision of how this would work going forward.
Yes, thank you, Spud. And John, yes, I think this would be it, a technical working group, right? Because there'll be many potential options to be explored. And if we have the opportunity to tap into the pool of statistical consultants, their experience with this issue will be really, really helpful in exploring what's possible, what's not possible, how this could tie into MRIP and other existing surveys, etc. So this, I think, is what would be necessary for us to develop a more detailed list of options, and those options could evolve into pilot studies to test, right, the efficacy of a couple or three of these approaches.
All right. So just to follow on to that, assuming that the council takes the recommendations and decides to integrate those into Amendment 46 and start Amendment 46 on the pathway towards ultimate approval, should we establish a new scope of work for this group, like I say, augmented, with perhaps some other individuals to become that technical working group and start working simultaneously with the council process, so that we hopefully arrive at a destination together to be able to implement pilot studies as soon as, assuming some sort of permit or permits are implemented.
Yeah, I think, Spud, we can take this and consider how to best pull it off? Do we, is it potentially something that serves as a, under the umbrella of the SSC, or is it something that we create essentially as an advisory panel? We have some different routes, under the Magnuson Act for groups like this. So I think we can build off of this and talk about it, staff level and with Sarah to make sure we do something that's proper and appropriate that will get us where we want to go.
Well, because we've talked about funding, and obviously funding is a driver for a lot of things. And, it seems like the sooner that we can get an ask into the system, to support conducting whatever pilot studies are deemed to be the priority. We need to get all this moving at the same time because, having pilot study designs, no money to fund them, we'll end up with a disconnect. And this goes back to managing expectations. I mean, if you put a permit in place and now, people in the fishing community are burdened with this permit, but they won't see anything different than the status quo for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. I mean, who knows? So that's just a concern. How do we do whatever we can to synchronize efforts so that we all arrive at the desired destination. So Chester.
Thanks, but John, I have a question. I know that we're not allowed to lobby as council members, but there are a number of groups I think that would have a lot of interest in this and do have representation in Washington. Can anybody even hazard a guess as to the amount of money that we'd be talking about? I mean, are we talking about $3 billion, or are we talking about 300,000, or are we talking about 3 million? I just don't know. But I think we need that information in order to perhaps get the pump primed and get some of the appropriate people talking about this in Washington. Be something happy to talk about as opposed to a lot of the unpleasantness that's going on up there right now.
Yeah, that's a good question, Chester, and you're absolutely right. We're not allowed to lobby, neither councils nor council members, so always keep that in mind. But there are groups that do take things like research needs that we've identified and carry them through the halls and try to say, hey, here's something that needs to be done. As far as cost, I would think we could probably find out through the MID and Garfo kind of what the costs were when they set up the tilefish electronic permitting system. NIFS probably knows. I don't know if we put John Foster on the spot for this. This stuff happened a while ago, but certainly the agency must have some idea how much it costs to, say, put in the HMS reporting, and may have some idea. I don't know, John, if you did, about what does it cost to run like the LPS survey every year. That in scale may be comparable to something like, if you were to do, say, that level of intensive reporting, mandatory reporting for something like the deep water species with their high PSEs traditionally and low ACLs. Maybe that's almost apples to comparison, apples to pears instead of apples to oranges, perhaps. So yeah, John, if we'd certainly be appreciative, but I'm sure we can dig that up if we need to.
Sure. So just sort of some rough numbers off the top of my head. The LPS, as I recall, costs somewhere between $800K and roughly $1 million a year. It's not, and bear in mind, that's only for 5 months. So the LPS only covers June through October. And that is, the intercept survey component as well as the effort survey component, although it gets a little messy there because the for hire sector there is covered by the the fishing effort survey is an add-on, so there could be some additional costs. It's not in what I threw out there, but so you'd be looking at probably more than that. Again, if you're going to cover a full year or even 10 months of the year or something along those lines. And I don't have a good sense of what the size of this permit group might be. In the Mid-Atlantic and New England regions for LPS, the angling category permit, you're looking at, I think it's typically between 10,000 and 15,000 vessel permits issued each year, or issued, or renewed, or newly issued. So I'm not sure how that would compare with what might be anticipated in the South Atlantic for refish. So again, those are, the full survey program might be anywhere from $1 to maybe $3 million. Again, very coarse, rough numbers. Could easily be more than that. And in terms of pilot studies, I mean, those costs can be all over the place. When we typically do a pilot study that's, maybe for a wave or two, so maybe 2 to 4 months, and recently they've all been, most of them have been effort survey related, so male survey designs. That's typically on the order of $100,000 to a few $100,000, but again, that can scale up or down dramatically depending on what the scope of the study is. The last thing I'll say, I mentioned the LPS redesign work that's going on. That's an intercept survey pilot study, and that's costing us on the order of roughly $300K to do 3 states for the 5 months of the LPS season. That's basically doing a side-by-side with the new intercept survey design against the existing LPS intercept survey. So those are some rough numbers. I don't know if they help or not, but that'd be at least a rough starting point for some discussions.
Thanks, John. I think that that's very helpful for some sort of frame of reference. So speaking of which, Bev, how many people are enrolled in the Florida Refish survey, just roughly?
You mean how many people have the permit, the free permit?
Yeah.
Oh, it's like over 600,000. But it's
Okay.
combined, that's Gulf and Atlantic combined. That's statewide.
Okay. Interesting. All right. Thanks.
So Spud, I'm wondering, is Florida free to indicate anything of what it costs for their survey and intercept efforts under this? Again, if it's not something that we can really talk about, that's fine. But that's the only other place I think of where there's some experience.
Well, I think John might have touched on it, but I mean, a big cost savings is if you can integrate it with existing surveys. For example, if you could, Eric Williams, I think, asked earlier about including an offshore site group in the APIS survey so that you hit those offshore sites more frequently. If you could do that and maybe just increase your APIS sample size a little bit, that would be a big cost savings right there. If you could integrate it with, what we're doing in Florida already with our state refish survey, there could be some cost savings there as well.
And Spud, if I might jump in quickly.
Go ahead.
Yes, and to Bev's point, you see, this is something that came up through, that sort of exploratory phase, discussion with the consultants. And they helped us think through a lot of these issues that, created efficiencies in the survey, facilitated, estimation and cost savings. And by the way, in terms of what, the appropriation that we have in place right now, I hope I'm not overstepping here, Jessica, I think this is public knowledge, that we have an appropriation of $3 million for the Florida State Reef Fish Survey. But that is a statewide, as Beth pointed out, survey that also goes beyond just the basic male and intercept surveys and integrates a few other components in terms of biological sampling and sea survey, etc.
All right, thanks, Luis. Just a couple of things that I've thought of. So this technical working group, I assume that they would also have within their scope of responsibilities to guide development of these side-by-side surveys that would be needed to support calibration, such as going on with the LPS. I assume that's correct. You see that, Luis? Is that part of their scope of work?
I'm sorry, but can you say that again?
Yeah, so that the technical working group, will they also have within their scope of work help and guide how to do these side-by-side surveys for calibration purposes?
Yeah, I would think that would be part of the process as well. I mean, ideally, right, that would be integrated into this whole process. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks. All right, Kester, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, from listening to the numbers that Luis just gave us, it kind of sounds like there might be additional startup costs, but once it's going, you might be talking a number like, maybe 2 times, maybe less what Florida is spending. So you're looking at maybe, I don't know, maybe 450, 4 million to 4.5 million. And goodness gracious, that's what it costs to operate a jet aircraft for about 3 hours. So, I mean, I think the point needs to be made that what we're talking about here not eliminates, but helps to eliminate a lot of the inefficiencies that we have seen that have caused a lot of heartache and have caused a lot of potential economic benefit from recreational fishing. And so, I mean, to me, it's almost silly to think that this would be something that would be a sticking point, would be the cost of this. It's just, you just got to get a champion up there to push it.
Yeah, and we sort of got the R&D part of it, which is related to pilot studies and determining the best survey designs, and then you've got the ongoing maintenance of the surveys, permitting programs once they're actually implemented. And but yeah, I mean, you've got to be able to articulate that, and you've got to be able to convince folks that there's going to be a tangible benefit from that investment. And I think that's always a challenge, and especially given the amount of time it takes to do the diligence necessary to make sure that you're making the best decisions that you can. So, okay. Well, at this point, I just want to open it up for anything that's on people's minds, maybe some topics we've sort of briefly touched on, but haven't really took a deep dive on, concerns, about the path forward, suggestions, ideas, anything at this point. All right, Amy.
Thanks, Bud. I want to go back to your first bullet under other, and we talked about the standing technical work group to guide those pilot projects and those calibration studies. I almost want to encourage a further step backwards to maybe making sure that the technical side of the house is at least discussed. I'm happy to continue to work with this working group and have those discussions, but it's those details I'm looking for, the minimum data elements, ensuring that the data is standardized and that those elements are clearly defined, maybe even prioritizing some of the things that a pilot project can do. Again, all thinking about the utility of the data, regardless of how the data is collected, but it's making sure that when we're asking these constituents to, hey, get this endorsement, and then by the way, we're going to ask for that data. I want to make sure that it goes from the very first point of getting the permit all the way back to the end of actually utilizing that data. And I don't want to miss the in-between guts. And your state partners are, I'm going to speak up for Georgia. I know there are a lot of great minds that are on this call, not only on this work group, but on the call in general, that are really passionate about seeing this sort of data collection ever come to play, and would be happy to help hash out some of those discussions.
Thanks, Amy, and that just makes me think, and this is a question back to anybody on the call, even if you're not on the work group, but you have interest in this. And is there a role for the ACCSP RecTech group on this? And if so, because when you talk about data standards, that's who I immediately start thinking about. Is there a role for that group? And if so, what would that role be?
Spud, this is Jeff. I think that was directed at me.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the RecTech is certainly, willing to show up and serve. From what I've heard on kind of this call and this point in the process, it sounds like maybe some definitions, more of the, goals and approaches that South Atlantic is looking for would be better defined before pulling in RecTech on a bit more of the how and how they can help, but certainly open to having their involvement if you guys see the need.
Well, I certainly
Go ahead.
don't want to overburden folks, but I'm just, thinking, we've got a vast reservoir of knowledge and experience out there, and how do we bring it best to bear on this so that the product that comes out of this is the best it can be? So, Beth, go ahead.
No offense to the RecTech committee. I served on that committee for many years, but that is a much more diverse group than I think is needed for this very specific question. People on the RecTech are from, they serve from states from Maine through Florida. And just thinking about our Florida rep, that's not the person I would select to be on this committee. So I would kind of steer clear of that. It seems like it might just introduce some extra noise that would take away from, a more focused group.
All right, thanks. Luis?
Thank you, Spud. And I just wanted to make a very general recommendation here, a suggestion. There's a consultant report that was produced. This was back in 2013, December 2013. This was released by the group of statistical consultants working with NIMS. And this was discussions of possible recreational catch assessment methods for red snapper, for Gulf red snapper, that were being considered at the time. This was the very first meeting of that group. And, the report, which John Carmichael, I believe, distributed to all of us, this is part of the briefing book for that first meeting of this working group, February 2021. So it should be in a folder there for us to check. And I think it's interesting, even if you don't read through the whole thing, it's only, I think, 9 or 10 pages long, but you can see how the consultants approach this, how they look at, okay, what question is being asked? What problem are we trying to solve? And they provide a suite, multiple options that could be possible. to be explored. And then through discussions, that larger group of suggestions was narrowed down to just a few to be pilot tested. So I think it's just an interesting report because it gives you that perspective of something very similar to this that has already been done. It will give you a perception of how that process can work.
Yeah, thanks, Luis. Thanks for that reminder. Certainly worth refreshing our understanding of that. Okay, Eric.
Yeah, I was just going to comment in a more general sense before we get too far in the weeds of, what work might need to be done or who's going to do it. I think it's more of a general, this is where the science comes in. And so I think it's probably better to engage in a more general sense of a memo or something from the council saying to the federal science entities, which in this case would be the Science Center and S&T, and then sort of articulate your needs to them and let them decide what is the best approach, whether it is to use contractors or not. I would hate to get the council too far down the road of sort of dictating science without getting science involved early on and the appropriate wing of science, which in this case, as Chester said, this will be a federal permit, more than likely a federal issue. So it should be the federal science entities leading it. Of course, that's just my opinion, and it doesn't always work out that way because I've been here long enough to see that too. But yeah.
All right, thanks. No, I certainly, I wouldn't advocating for, council being too prescriptive in the amendment, but rather us all moving forward together to again ensure the best chance of success. So let me throw this one out there for some feedback and discussion because I think this will be very relevant in council discussions, and that is how would a permit, either vessel-based or individual-based, help improve our understanding, quantification of discards? Because obviously that is, a very tough issue for us to grapple with. So I'd like some feedback from folks on the work group on that. Again, not that will be anything prescriptive in the amendment, but I think it'll be important in the discussion as part of the rationale for this and in the purpose and need, possibly. Anybody want to bite on that one?
I suspect, Spud, it'll come down to what the council requires. Like when we did the for hire reporting and we required reporting of the fish that are discarded by species, then the thought is that helps to give us that data. And that's intended to be a census level reporting. So I think ultimately it would come down to those devil in the details of how the different reporting components are developed. That's going to be a big challenge, I think, throughout this. And then I also think as we consider this technical working group to bring in state people and such and to work on this and particularly to work on this question too, it's probably going to have to be recognized and organized as an advisory panel in the eyes of Magnuson so that we can have, say, state folks and others on there. And they're going to give recommendations, but we do have to bear in mind the council only has so much authority in terms of how it dictates the details of science, as kind of has been suggested in some recent comments along those lines. So we will be careful there because, if you keep in mind the for hire reporting effort, the council required mandatory reporting of all fish on all trips by a certain date. And that's the nature of the types of recommendations that would go here. Say, we would require, say, reporting of all, if you went the deep water route, reporting of these species, and their discards or something. You'd have to specify it in that way. And then the agency goes in and uses its expertise to come up with some of the details as we saw in for hire. But we also, through the amendment process, have the opportunity to provide guidance. And that's where I think this working group really could come in to assist the information that gets processed up through our IPT process and into the council in the same way that our species advisory panels do that. So I think it's totally feasible to do this. It may add some time to our process, but I think that's the lesson throughout all of this. The more complexity we bring in, the more time we're adding. But I think we'd rather do a little bit of that than go out and not consider things fully and mess up expectations as we roll this out. So I think that's time well spent. And see, Eric's got his hand up, so I'm sure he has some thoughts on discards for us.
All right, go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I'm actually not going to talk about discards, but talk about the fact that you're discussing discard estimates is not a permit. That's not, in fact, it's not even necessarily related to the permit. So I hope we keep those concepts different. That's a logbook then. If you're going to start querying people about discards, that's a logbook effort, as simple as it could be. And the only thing they report could be discards, but it's still, that's different from just getting everybody in the universe permitted so that we can identify them. So again, you know, I want to be careful that we keep the science separate from the regulatory action. The regulatory action here is get a permit in place. The science part is what do we do with that, and whether we implement a survey or not. We might have to circle back to the regulatory part if we wanted to require a logbook or have some penalties in place for a logbook or anything like that. But just make sure we understand the difference between just a permit that identifies the members of the universe versus then querying that universe is a logbook type mechanism.
Well, my intent on bringing it up was, you know, again, you know, before we saddle fishermen with yet another requirement in an already complicated world, you know, there needs to be a return on the effort. And, you know, we know how important discards are now. So merely what I was seeking input on was if you have a defined universe of people who are fishing in a fishery where there are discards, does that provide you with a mechanism to improve your ability to estimate discard? You know, whatever mechanism you use to do it, voluntary, mandatory, or whatever. But I would assume that you would be able to do that better than we're doing now. But perhaps I'm wrong. So.
Well, so yeah, just to follow up on that, Spud, if you don't mind indulging me, and that is that, you know, if you look at our overall discard data collection for the South Atlantic, it's almost entirely self-reported. And so to the degree that we start getting more, say, discard reports, they're still ultimately self-reported and unvalidated. So to the degree that challenge hasn't been met, or we don't fully understand the bias of that self-reported data, that's the best we can do. So in the sense of sort of kind of asking your question, if we got a better grip on this universe of private boat anglers that are fishing snapper grouper, we could target them with more pings from either through APIS or something else to get discard reports from them. But again, the ultimate problem there is it's self-reported. So in this context of permitting the universe, it could improve our estimates, but they may still ultimately be biased because they're largely unvalidated.
Well, this is important because it goes back to what we've talked about in managing expectations. You know, when we have fisheries where we have high rates of discards and we're looking at severe constraints on allowable harvest because of discards, people want a better way for us to estimate discards. So again, it just goes back to managing expectation. All right, anything else that's on people's minds about this? John C., are we at a point where this can be coalesced? Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick comment. As you and the group were talking about improving information on discarded fish, you know, MRIP goes through a process of recreational, you know, prioritized implementation planning for the whole region. And the first one for the Atlantic coast was 2017. We're renewing that now. discards is one of the high priorities coastwide to improve that kind of information. If the council, already a part of that prioritization process, wanted to weigh in on that portion of the implementation plan, prioritizing discarded fish data collection, kind of separate for all fisheries is where we're looking at it. I think that's one approach that could weigh in and support those developments. I mean, that implementation plan is kind of how the MFA additional sampling money came about. So I think the discards and using the permits as a frame to go get more information would be a useful approach. So I'm certainly in support of that research recommendation that was under item 3.
All right, thanks. I'm just trying to capture as many potential benefits, albeit tempered with reality, that could be generated by some sort of permitting system in the snapper grouper fishery. So, all right, anything else? Back to you, John Carmichael. You think we're in a good place here?
I think we are, Spud, and I think I go back to some of John Foster's earlier comments about how just having the universe can help with the stratification and the existing surveys. So that means it potentially does help with discards. We all know one of the problems is, identifying people that really fished far offshore with a 300 to 200 mile strata. You just went fishing out there in that area. That's a pretty big chunk of effort. So refining that probably ultimately does help the discard estimation, as you were saying. And, and I think that gets at one of the underlying concepts is, the permit can potentially be used in different ways. And I think this, tech group, if we treat this as a bit of an AP to help develop this, I think we can keep working closely with MRIP as we have through this process to find out, well, if we did this, what could that do? That'll help us put better text in front of the council. And, I think, hats off to John and company and Richard. They've been very honest, I feel like, about what could be done if different things have been done. And, this goes back to the first discussions at our SSC of the data limited species, the rare event species. I think they've been straightforward and on message about the realities of that throughout the whole time. So, I think if we continue that through this working group, that's a good way to better put this together. And I feel like we have a lot of good stuff here that, Spud, you and I can work on cleaning this up into some strong recommendations for the council, perhaps a number of points to consider to fold into the amendment and start getting that process rolling. And I do want to say too, we kind of started this, Eric Williams, as he often does, kind of set the group down on a path that clearly was a direction we really needed to go, which was to start, thinking about the realities of the different reporting approaches and how it might work, because that is why we're talking about a permit in the first place. So, Eric, you got a knack for that. So glad you were here today to work your subtle little magic there and send us down this path, because it's been great discussion. And I see John Foster has his hand up, so pass it off to him.
Go ahead, John.
Okay, thank you. I just sort of wanted, I think John touched on some of it, and going back to Eric's point about the permit being, essentially a tool that can create options that may not currently exist or really don't exist in a very good way. So in my mind, it's all dependent. The outcomes are dependent on how the permits might be used, but they create options that right now either don't currently exist or would be very difficult to implement otherwise. They facilitate, those options. So I think if you're looking for ways to sort of present it in a light that would generate buy-in, that's kind of the approach that I would if I were doing it, I would take is, we don't have definite answers on it's going to improve this or that, or result in this outcome or that outcome, but it creates options in terms of data collection and monitoring that, again, that we don't currently have, or we don't have in a way that it would be optimized by having something like the permit.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think that's really a good summary, that it does provide opportunities for improvement. Exactly how those opportunities will take place will be a work in progress, and it will be, as we all know, an evolving process. It has to be sometimes. So, okay. Well, I certainly don't want to hold everybody to 5 o'clock just for purposes of taking up time, but Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what John Foster just said. I think that is actually the core message, if anything. If that's sort of the message we want to tell the council, is this has potential for great opportunity, and that's the benefit of this. That is the huge pro of this, is the potential that this creates is only funded limited, essentially.
Yes, that's a common problem, but hopefully we can prevail over that. So, all right, I do have a member of the public that wishes to comment, and I'll certainly open it up to other members of the public if they'd like to. So, Thomas Newman, you've expressed interest in commenting, so go right ahead.
Yes, sir. Thank you for giving me some time, Spud. I know I'm coming late to the game, but I was just listening today and I had a few ideas. The electronic reporting in the Northeast is really simplified the logbook for commercial fishermen, and I know the Southeast is still developing in theirs, but that'd be a big game changer for the recreational logbooks if that's the direction they're heading. And also, there needs to be some sort of some way to verify the what you're getting. If everything is voluntarily reported, I feel like you're going to get a lot of underreporting, especially in species such as snapper, where the guys don't want the quota to get caught up so quick. Just thought there need to be some dockside monitoring and whatnot. And my other concern was when MRIP was initiated, a lot of guys got butt hurt when all these quotas got caught up so much quicker. North Carolina, a good example of that is the southern flounder. And I think if those guys had to self-report, they'd be underreporting just so they don't have to worry about a season closure for 2 or 3 years. Because right now, if we were looking at paybacks in that fisheries coming up next year, they went over their quota by 4 times. So they're looking at a 2 to 3 year season closure. I just thought there needs to be looking at some sort of mechanism to quantify the results you're getting if there's going to be a self-reported logbook or whatnot. I don't know if it's dockside surveys or observers or cameras taking pictures of everything you catch or whatnot, but I just feel like there needs to be some sort of honesty system in it if you're going to go into that, because I hate to throw another curveball in the recreational industry after we just got the big curveball of MRIP just a couple of years ago. I don't want nothing to completely skew the numbers in another direction here in the next 5 to 10 years. But that's just my short comments, and that's a big job you guys got going on.
Thank you. And yes, we certainly all grapple with the fact that responses to voluntary surveys can run the whole gamut, depending on folks wanting to hopefully game the system for a desired outcome. And we certainly understand that. And there will always be a challenge in data collection when you don't have 100% validation, but I appreciate your comments. Any other members of the public that are listening in that would like to make a comment? All right, go ahead, Martha.
Y'all hear me? Can y'all hear me?
Yeah, I got you loud and clear.
Okay, great. So, hey everyone, this is Martha Gaius. representing the American Sport Fishing Association. I really enjoyed the conversation this afternoon. You know, I think you've touched on a lot of really important points. This is a big thing to do. There's a lot of moving parts, and it's going to be a delicate dance to pull together all the different pieces to get where you want to go. So I guess just a couple of big ideas to put out there, you know, to put in front of the council when you all chew on this in March, and I'm looking forward to being at that meeting. So I think what the council needs to do here is, as they're thinking about, you know, permit or no permit, are we doing vessels, are we doing individuals? You know, it's tempting to get into the weeds and try to iron out a lot of those details, but the council really needs to focus on what is it that we want to achieve, right? And so, and why. So I think that is, in this case, you know, having more precise and timely data, and think about why you need that. And then you can think about, you know, how this tool could work. I think the discussion today about needing to pull in other groups to make this work and come up with the details is right on. And, you know, ultimately, you're going to need to have buy-in, not just from the council and the public and the MRIP folks and Congress and the Science Center and, you know, Big NOAA as a whole. And so all of those things it can be a challenge. It's gonna take some time and patience, but, you know, the council, I think, they can set the track for coming up with where to go and the timelines, just being mindful of all of those things. And I'm rambling at this point, so I'll stop. I didn't write down any remarks or anything like that, but I just thank you for the conversation and the opportunity to just reflect a little bit at the end of this call.
Thank you, Martha. And yes, it's my hope and ambition that this will be an outcome-driven process with a clearly articulated outcome, and then we work backwards from that outcome to do our best to achieve it. So thank you. All right, Michelle, go right ahead. Good to hear from you.
Hey, Spud, can't believe that we're on the same webinar, like within 12 hours again, but I promise not to mess things up or result in any extended conversation like we experienced yesterday. But I mean, I guess just a couple points. First, it's really great to hear how this conversation has progressed. I think, you know, like Jessica and I and Luis are folks and John, you know, have been hearing about this and talking about this for a really long time. So it's great to see, you know, this moving forward. And I guess just reflecting on, you know, some of the comments with respect to recreational reporting in other regions and the use of a vessel permit. I think, you know, someone mentioned that it might have been Chester that, you know, in the Mid-Atlantic, we have a tilefish vessel permit, you know, that does allow for anglers to be, the number of anglers on the vessel to be reported. And when I think about that and think about what y'all are embarking on, I do think that at some point, and this is in reference to Bev's comment of having like a smaller sort of technical group of folks to focus on this early on, I do think it would be important to share that maybe at some point with the broader rec tech group. You know, I feel like some of the concerns with recreational permitting and reporting are probably shared between council regions, and I think the more that folks can share, you know, their lessons and successes and how they're thinking about things, I think it leads to less of a patchwork quilt up and down the coast. So that's all I had to say, but thanks a lot for letting me listen in today. Great conversation.
Thank you, Michelle. Appreciate it. And Yes, yesterday afternoon was a test of endurance, but we got through it. Maybe not where everybody wanted to be, but at least we got through it. So, any other members of the public listening in that would like, or folks that, agency folks that aren't on the work group would like to make a comment, I'll open it up to anybody who's interested. All right, no hands. Okay. Well, we will take what we've discussed today, the notes, and we will distill this down to a set of recommendations. And John, perhaps we can, if we can get this done early enough, we can vet it back through the group for some fine tuning before we take it out to the council at the meeting in March. How does that sound?
We may be able to. It's pretty tight. I think briefing book stuff has to be in Myra next week. It's a pretty quick turnaround to get stuff together, so it may not be possible. But I do think we have a great lead for the report there, Spud, that permits have potential for creating data collection opportunities.
Yeah.
That's a strong outcome from the group, and we then can build from there.
Yeah, that's the elevator speech. 30-second elevator speech. So, all right, if there's not any other comments or business, I'll adjourn our meeting. Thanks everybody for the discussion. It's been a good one. It's an ambitious undertaking. I'm much more optimistic about this than I was when we started a year ago. We've obviously got some rocky ground to plow, but I think if all of us pulling on the traces, we can get it done. And I guess I'll work with John and we'll figure out what we do going forward to potentially convert this group, or some of its members, all of its members, augmented into some sort of advisory panel to stay within our governance structure. Any last remarks, John? See?
Just thanks to everyone for these 4 meetings and the great discussion and information we've had.
All right, thanks everybody, and y'all have a good one.
Oh, Spud, just one last thing. Thank you for stepping up to the plate and serving as chair. You did a great job. Really, really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It's it's easy to be a conductor when you got a great orchestra. So thanks everybody, and we'll stand adjourned.
Thanks.
Thank you. On a Spudism.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Bud.
Thank you all.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.